Okay, guys, this is Mr. Cannon, and this is our first lesson in U.S. History A. We're going to be discussing the early colonies today, the colonial period of American history. One of the first things we want to look at are the regions of colonial America. And once the 13 colonies are established by England, and we know the story before we even get to this point, how Columbus and other explorers came over to America. Eventually, England, France, and Spain are going to set up colonies in America, but it's going to be England that sets up the 13 colonies that's going to become the United States eventually. And so we're going to be looking at these 13 colonies today, these English colonies, and they really divided into three distinct regions. The first region was called the New England region, and you can see there it's in red. It has Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. This region is going to be people that are moved here are going to be primarily for religious freedom. That's the reason they come here to begin with. Then we have in the pink what are known as the middle colonies. The middle colonies are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. They are really the most diverse group of colonies out of all three groups. And we'll talk about why they were so diverse in a minute. And then at the bottom, of course, in the yellow, you have the southern colonies, which included Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. And to begin with, North and South Carolina were combined, and it was just called Carolina. But you can see there, those were the 13 English colonies divided into three distinct regions. Now, what was so distinct about each of those regions? Well, let's look at it right now, and let's start with New England. New England, the people that are going to found New England are called Puritans or Pilgrims. Now, these people were persecuted for their religious beliefs in England, and because of that, they came to America. To begin with, the Pilgrims went to the Netherlands, but they didn't like how their kids were growing up to be Dutch, so they decided to move their kids to this new world, America, and they came over on the Mayflower. You know that story. But the bottom line is, even though they came over here for religious freedom, they didn't really give religious freedom to any group outside of their church, which was called the Congregational Church. Really, you had to be a member of that church to establish yourself in New England. But there is no doubt that they did come over here for religious freedom. They wanted to come over here to be able to practice their religion, and to have what they called a shining city on a hill, which was a ideal society for them. They did believe in egalitarianism, which is the belief that you have a voice in your own community. It was the idea of equality in the community. Don't want you to think that meant that women were completely equal to men in that society, because they were not. But that society, the Puritan society, did tend to give women more of a voice. Even though they didn't have a vote, they had more of a voice at what was called the town meetings. And the town meetings would be these meetings where everyone in the community would come together and would vote on every single issue in the community, in the town. Economically, New England, its climate is cold. You know that even today, guys. If you travel up into the Boston area, into Maine, you know that it's very cold up there. And because it's a cold climate and the growing seasons are short, they really did not have a lot of cash crops in New England. In other words, they didn't have these massive farms where they grew cash crops to make money. What they did do is they fished, a lot of great fishing off of New England's coast. They whaled. In other words, they fished for whales, and whales were used for a number of different things. They built ships, so shipbuilding was a big deal, and that's in the picture there. You can see them building a ship. And they subsistence farms. Subsistence farm. The majority of New Englanders were small farmers. They grew just enough to feed their own families. That's what subsistence farming is. And so that really is sort of how they made a living in New England. But it's going to be very different from the society we look at in the southern colonies. And so almost from the get-go, we're going to see that these areas in America are going to have very different cultures develop in America. And of course, that's going to eventually lead to a split in America in the Civil War. Even before we get to the Revolution, we're going to see that split is already sort of taking place, where the different regions of America are very different in their culture and in their economy. All right, let's talk about the middle colonies. One of the most important term when it comes to the middle colonies is trade, trade, trade. And you know the term triangular trade, and that was the idea that you had this triangle of trade going between Europe, Africa, and North America. A lot of these items, and you can see some of the items there, slaves are included in those items, but a number of those items are going to come into the middle colonies. And the reason for that is because the ports in the middle colonies are so big and so good. If you think about New York City, you know, the reason New York City is going to become the city that it is because of its port. It has a huge port, New York Harbor. And because of that, you're going to have a lot of different people from around the world coming into the middle colonies, which means it's going to be the most diverse group of colonists. And diversity is going to be a big deal in the middle colonies. Because of that, there is going to be a little more religious freedom in the middle colonies than we would see in New England, for example. There's going to be more religious freedom in those middle colonies. Now, let's talk about triangular trade here for a minute. The idea of trading between these areas, that's the whole reason that these colonies are going to be set up to begin with. It's called mercantilism, okay? So what Europe, the nations of Europe, and in this case we're talking about England, what England's trying to do with the 13 colonies is they want to make money off of those colonies. The way you make money off of those colonies is through mercantilism, meaning that you take raw materials that you can't grow in your country or you can't find in your country, but you can find in the colonies. Then you force those colonies to sell you, only you, that is England, those goods, and then in turn you sell them to the rest of the world. And in doing so, you're going to make money off of trade that way. So mercantilism did benefit the colonies, especially in the South, but the biggest group, who benefits from mercantilism is the mother countries, and in our case, England. England benefited the most from mercantilism. Now, in the middle colonies, there are all kinds of goods that are going to be traded. The middle colonies did a little bit of everything. They had some cash crops like the South did. They're going to have shipbuilding just like the North did, and fishing. And then they're going to be known as the breadbasket of America, because it's in these middle colonies that the vast majority of our wheat was grown during this period. No, it's no longer like that today, but that's how it was during this period. All right, and then our last group of colonies we need to discuss are the southern colonies. And of course, the southern colonies are going to develop the plantation system. The plantation system is going to come from the Caribbean. It's going to come from those islands in the Caribbean. In fact, South Carolina, many of its early settlers came from the island of Barbados, which is a tiny island in the Caribbean. And what they brought with them from the Caribbean was the knowledge of how to set up plantations. Okay, these plantations are vast, large plots of land, thousands of acres in some cases, where you could grow cash crops like tobacco, naval stores, which are like pitch and tar, and you use that pitch and tar to build ships, naval, that's why it's called naval stores. Rice is another profitable cash crop, and indigo. Rice and indigo, especially in South Carolina, were very profitable. You can see there in the picture, that is a rice plantation. That is a painting of a rice plantation, which was, you can see there who's doing the work. Slaves. And that's what became a big part of the southern colonies and eventually the southern states, was this idea of slaves working on these plantations. Now, the majority of people who lived in the South did not live on plantations. The majority lived on tiny, small farms, subsistence farms. But the plantations of the South are going to be what dominates the economy of the South. Those planters, even though they're a minority of the population, there aren't many of them, they are the most important members of the society. An aristocracy is going to be set up where those planters are going to sort of be in charge of everything. They're going to control the economy, they're going to control the culture, they're going to control politics, the government. Okay? And then underneath that aristocracy of planters, You had poor whites, and that's the majority of the population. And then at the bottom of the society, of course, were slaves who were brought over from Africa and forced into working against their will. And then, of course, like we said, slave labor is going to provide the majority of the wealth for the southern colonies. The southern colonies are going to become very wealthy. In fact, South Carolina became the wealthiest colony in America. 9 of the 10 richest people in colonial America lived in and around Charleston, South Carolina. And they were rice planters. That shows you how profitable it was. But as profitable as it's going to be to the colonies, it's going to be even more profitable to the mother country, England. Okay, so we've got the New England colonies, we've got the middle colonies, and now we've got the southern colonies. All right, one of the hallmarks of colonial America from the very beginning is the idea of representative government, self-government. It's the idea that Americans, Englishmen who come to America, are going to govern themselves. We see it from the beginning. In the Mayflower Compact, for example. The Mayflower Compact was written, of course, on the Mayflower when the Pilgrims came over here in 1620. Even before they got off the ship, they wrote a document that basically said they were going to make the laws for themselves. In other words, they're going to govern themselves. We call that self-government. Another word for that is democracy. So we can see that at the very beginning of our founding. The House of Burgesses is another example of this. Virginia, which is the first colony founded in 1607, is going to have a legislative body that's going to make the rules for the colony. That is a representative government, guys. That's the beginnings of the kind of government we have today in America. And this is a big deal because it shows us that even from the beginning, America was on the path to being a republic. And eventually that's what's going to cause Americans to overthrow England and become their own country. And so representative government, self-government is going to be a big deal in America. If we even go to New England, the town meetings that I told you about earlier are an example of that self-government, where you had everybody in the town that would come together and vote on individual laws. Now, that's not the way our system works today because we have way too many people in America to vote on every single law, but we do elect people to vote on our laws. That's called representative government. Right? And then the last thing we want to talk about in this particular lesson is salutary neglect. Okay, so early on in America's existence, even though England has these rules that govern the colonies, they're going to leave them alone for the most part. They're not going to enforce those rules. That's called salutary neglect, basically just neglecting to enforce those rules. And the reason they're going to neglect it is they don't really have a desire to enforce those laws. And the second reason is, look at the distance between England and its colonies. Look at the distance from England to Charleston, South Carolina. 4,000 miles. That's a long way away. Now today, of course, we have planes and we have ships that can travel very quickly across the ocean. But back then, we did not. It took months to get from England to America. It took a long time. And because of that great distance, the colonies are going to enjoy being left alone. They're going to have that self-government where they're going to make their own rules. And even though England might have had rules that were against their rules, England's going to leave them alone and let them do their own thing. And the colonies are going to get used to that. And of course, that's going to be a problem when England eventually decides that they're not going to leave the colonies alone anymore. Because eventually what's going to happen is England is going to take away salutary neglect. England is going to decide that after the French and Indian War, that the colonies should have to pay for part of that war. So they begin taxing the colonies, and the colonies don't like it. They don't like it one bit. And so salutary neglect eventually is going to be one of the reasons the American Revolution happens. That you get used to being left alone. It's sort of like if your parents leave you alone and let you do what you want to do, and then all of a sudden they start being strict and saying, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't stay up as late as you've been staying up. You can't use your phone as much as you've been using your phone. You wouldn't like that one bit because you would be like, wait a minute, you let me get away with this for years now. Why are you making these strict rules